secret truth. Through forgiveness we awaken, transforming information and knowledge into wisdom. And now our co-hosts, Charlotte Littlefield and George Butler.
Welcome to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler along with
Charlotte Littlefield.
Well, welcome Alan Watt to our program. We certainly appreciate you being with us this evening.
It's a pleasure to be back on, George.
Well, I tell you, there's a lot going on out here, isn't there?
Well, yeah, you can't rest for a second, and there's a big change somewhere in the world. Breakneck speed, and we can't even keep up with it. Apart from that, we've got to figure out ourselves what's really going on, because the media isn't of much help to us.
Yeah.
No, they just propaganda.
Yeah. There's no in-depth explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, you do a lot about predictive programming and stuff. Do you see this unfolding like they have planned? How about the plan? What about the plan?
Well, even this part of it to do with this extended bank crash and then the incredible bailout of the same banks by the taxpayer, which really was all planned in advance because they knew 2 or 3 years before it that it was going to happen. That's been announced now and admitted to by a lot of the big players. And so we're ripped off, and then they're going into the next step of the crash. But really what it's to do is to bring up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the Bank for International Settlements. These are all really one group. They were set up, some of them before World War II and some during World War II. But these were set up by a handful of bankers, really, banking families, to bring in a new system for the entire planet. So what we're going through really is just the planned chaos, so they can come forward and tell us we've got to give all the power of national bookkeeping for your own government over to the IMF because we can't manage it. That's really what they're pushing in Europe right now. And the IMF is going into every country there and doing the bookkeeping. But what they want is the right to do it for perpetuity. That they aren't going to just go in, clean up the mess and walk out again. They want to stay in your books and do your books and keep an eye on your books for you. It's a World Bank, you see, that we're going under, and this is all part of the strategy. They're going to terrify us all into the usual state of hysteria until we beg them to do something, and what they do is exactly what they wanted to do in the first place. This is the typical technique that's used.
Some people have thought that there would be like a big false flag operation in America or something. Do you think it might take the form of just a financial crash that could create enough chaos and hysteria and so forth?
I tell you, I really will take whatever is necessary. Whatever is necessary. These guys at the top have a constant stream of information. They've got the pulse of the public. They know what we're up to, what we're thinking, what we're worried about. They know if we're blasé about something and not worried enough about something, and they can step it up, and they'll do whatever it takes to get their plan through. We've got to remember that the group of international bankers that run the world was well documented by Professor Carroll Quigley in his book Tragedy and Hope. And he talked about the whole goal of this cabal of men, and he worked for them, remember. He's a member of their group. The CFR is the branch in America. And the Royal Institute of International Affairs is the British branch. And he was the historian for them. But he said the whole plan was for bankers and intellectuals to come to the fore over generals and presidents and prime ministers and petty politicians and run the world the way they thought it should be run. And this was all part of it, was to take over the money supply of the entire planet step by step and gradually. And they've done that really step by step. We forget that at one time everybody was on a gold standard. Every nation was on a gold standard. They did not have at one time fractional reserve banking, which they've had up until fairly recently. With fractional reserve banking, you only had to keep about 1/10 of the deposits in the bank at any time, and you lend out 90% of it, So And then for each one they lend out to, they can do the same thing again, 90%, 90%, 90%. So each time the bank gives a loan out, really, they're creating money out of nothing, and they're adding to the debt to the country. So it's a complete Fiat scam in the first place. It's like the global warming. If they can pull off the banking scam, which has been very successful, obviously, because most folk think it's normal, then they can literally get us to pay for carbon credits and fees to save the planet, while they trade carbon credits with each other. And it's the best scam ever, because Al Gore helped set it up on behalf of his masters, The Rothschild came forward in France and the one in Britain, and they said that all the carbon taxes that's going to be brought in will go through their bank, their private family bank in Switzerland. What a great deal. So here you have a carbon credit economy going to take over from the old consumer society, where the peasants pay everything back in taxes and fees for the privilege of living, and the bankers don't have to put any outlay out for anything. They create nothing. They don't have to store carbon or anything else. They just get these carbon credits that we all pay for the privilege of being alive. We're living in Disneyland right now, and it's been taught to the people that it's all quite natural. That's the power of predictive programming.
Well, I tell you, what about the drug trade out there? Is the big money controlling that from behind the scenes?
It always has. It always. If you go into the history, find it. They're very, very old. Banking. It doesn't surprise me that bankers would form a cabal in the 1800s and decide to take over the world. You see, we're taught through movies and the silly history books we get that it's always men who want to wear uniforms and be generals and conquer the world. And that's what we get, Alexander the Great and so on. It never dawns on most people that the bankers also want to take over the world. And that you do have powerful, rich families, just like ancient Rome. They're intermarried, just like any other royalty. In fact, banking is a form of royalty. They're intermarried to keep their wealth, and then they end up controlling royalty in some cases. But they have histories of economics. Very few people wrote true histories on any particular technique or science in ancient times, but bankers certainly did. They knew the trades, the trade routes they owned as well. They knew how they could rise economies by bringing great wealth into it via gold or silver. Even before they made the coinage, they used to weigh it. And they kept records of sales too and commerce. So they also knew that they could lose out at times if countries went to war, especially if they financed them, and perhaps one of the countries would lose. There was no international settlement. They didn't have a bank of international settlement to make the loser pay off their debts to them. So they rectified all that down through time. But basically, you're looking at a science and techniques of the histories of different countries and the rising and falling of different empires down through time through bankers' eyes. So they kept records of how everything happened. So we go into the 20th century with a system of central banks. Now, central banks are private banks, owned again by the same guys, the dozen families that own the World Bank. There's only about 12 banking families that are international moneylenders. And they put their own people in these central banks of each nation. So they've got that all sewn up already. Now, the central banks generally don't have to disclose their bookkeeping or their profits or where money is going to any government audit. In fact, when the Rothschilds took over the Bank of England, that was the first condition they made, that the government would never, ever, through the generations in perpetuity again, they would never audit the private Bank of Rothschild. And that's still the same today. There's never been an audit done. It's the same with the U.S. too, the Federal Reserve and so on. These are all central banks.
When we come back, perhaps we could talk about Ron Paul's effort to audit the Federal Reserve.
You're listening to GCN, the Genesis Communications Radio Network.
Welcome back to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler along with
Charlotte, Littlefield, and welcome back, Alan Watt. Alan, before we get too much further in the program, I'd like to let the listening audience know about your website, Cutting Through the Matrix. That's Cutting Through, THROUGH, thematrix.com. And you have a very extensive website, Alan, and if people go to your website, what are some of the things you hope to show them?
I hope to show them really how we've been trained from birth really into accepting a system that we think is very official and legally recognized and all above board to do with not just the money system and the banking system, but also our very reason for being here. Most people are taught to be employees, for instance, at school. They don't really promote independence and small business. And most folk, never even think about that. They go straight from school to work, chasing a carrot, anybody can make it sort of idea, and then pay their taxes. Well, the big boys, of course, that run the banking system and commerce for the world have been living off our taxes for well over 100 years. And yet it's strange too that most people will vote the same parties in left wing, right wing, whatever, time and time again, and yet we still end up with massive debt. And if you could find the taxes that you pay personally, from your property taxes to your income taxes to your purchase taxes that are hidden in everything that you buy, it's staggering the amount of cash that flows towards the government, but there's never enough. There's never enough. And supposedly they have to go and borrow from bankers. Well, there's something awfully wrong with your governmental system in every country, by the way. They're all the same now. They're all standardized. There's something awfully wrong if they can't keep afloat with the money that comes into them. And not only that, then the governments will tell us, well, we give billions away every year to third world countries and various projects and so on. And we also borrow money from the World Bank to lend to third world countries. And they put the citizens, you and I, down as the guarantors for the deals that always fall through. Since when did your government become a bank in itself by lending money out to other countries, money that they've borrowed? This is written nowhere in any country's constitution. There's nothing to do with that. Where you only find that, your government can literally borrow money from foreign and private banks and lend it out to other countries and put you and your children's children down as the guarantors to pay off that debt for the money they borrowed to give away. This is incredibly crazy, and yet we think it's all normal simply because we've been trained that we've got to listen to experts. And until a well-recognized and very popular expert comes on mainstream television and tells the people what I've just told them, no one is going to believe it.
Well, they're born into it, Alan.
Yep.
Right from the birth certificate.
Yep.
The whole process.
Mm-hmm.
People are born into it. They can't see it.
And their parents didn't know. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and they're not taught, and it's quite shocking when you finally see the system and the racket for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite shocking.
And as a racket, you're right on. That's the word for it. It's an incredibly good racket, and it's been going on for a long time. As I say, Professor Carl Quigley, who was a member, high-ranking member, and the official historian for the American front group that runs on behalf of this banking cabal, he wrote about it in his own book, Tragedy and Hope. And he was all for the idea that bankers should, and intellectuals, academia, in other words, experts and scientists should run the world. If you notice, when Obama came in, there's a whole string of people that's been appointed behind him, and they're calling them science czars and other kinds of czars. That's a very interesting term that the media itself has coined, because that's what they call them in the Soviet Union, the commissars,
Oh, yeah. And
go
of course,
back.
Go ahead, George.
Does some of this structure go back to Rome and some of that, organization there?
Well, ancient Rome, you're talking about ancient Rome?
Yes,
Yeah, ancient Rome had a form of, you understand, there's never ever really been a true democracy. There never has been in the world. Supposedly Greece started it, but when you look at the history of Greece, it was only people who were very wealthy in Greece that could get a vote. maybe 25% of the people. And it was very much based on what later became in the 20th century the Nazi system, that you had to prove in Greece that your family had been there for maybe 2, 3, or 4 generations. So the genealogy came into it as well. Most of the folk had no vote at all, and the rest were slaves. The bulk of the population ended up being slaves. And that's what you find, by the way, in countries that they call democracies. And most of the folk are slaves in one form or another. And then Rome took the same system over. Rome was very uninventive, really. It copied everything from Greece. And they also went out to conquer. And what's astonishing is you find the banking families existed back then too, international banking families. It takes money to set up armies and get them off to war. It takes money and the know-how and bookkeeping to supply them for the supply lines and so on. And you find that the international bankers would send out their representatives along with the invading armies of Rome. And they would then be the paymasters, the tax collectors over the conquered countries, and they would take a good chunk for themselves as well. I mean, there's always been slavery in one form or another, and that's exactly what Charles Galton Darwin said in his book, The Next Million Years. And he was all for the slavery system, another elitist, where he thought academics and scientists should rule the world, that the experts should rule it, not just the wannabe politicians that do it for personal gain. So all down through the ages, they bandied this term about democracy. Even Plato said democracy had been tried in Greece, as all the other types in fascism and so on. And he says democracy always ends up with totalitarianism and eventually a sort of dictatorship, a sort of communistic dictatorship. And we see it happening today, the same kind of system coming in. Collectivism is what they're calling it, world collectivism under the United Nations, a single banking system run by the World Bank, the guys who run your central banks, the IMF basically. And eventually they'll take over not just the money supply, but also the entire food supply of the world according to the UN's mandate. The Department of Agriculture has stated in their mandate that one day they will dish out the food to each region of the world in an attempt to force down population. So they'll give food to, say, the Americas. There'll be a joint Americas, a unified Americas, and you'll get the same quota every year. And if your population goes up, then it's your problem. You've got to find a way to bring it down because you're getting no more food. They've actually said this. So the public are kept in la-la land, you know.
There been a concerted effort by the people that really control things to make a collective world system, but with a fascist overlord type of slavery. Is something like that going on?
That's right. You see, I'm fascinated by studying what they call socialism. I heard so many different versions of socialism and even communism.
Okay, let's go into a little more detail when we come back on those differences and why they're moving the world in that direction. We'll be right back. Thank you for being with us, Alan.
Sure.
Welcome back to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler along with
Charlotte Littlefield, and welcome back, Alan Watt.
It's a pleasure.
Creator of Cutting Through the Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Alan, we ended that last segment talking about socialism and so forth and communism.
Yep.
Give us your view on how that's evolved and what's really behind that. Who's behind all that?
Well, the bankers like socialism. Socialism is where the government really goes to the bankers all the time to borrow more money for their big spending and building projects. That's really the key to socialism. So bankers really help set up a socialistic system across the world. They like that system, and they get the government themselves to be the collection agencies through the IRS and different methods of getting money off the people. That's really what socialism is. And the communistic type, as Stalin said himself, he said that the Soviet system was just, or communism was just socialism in a hurry. And he's quite right about that, because if you were to try and combine all the little countries that eventually formed the communist old Soviet bloc, it would have taken you maybe another 150 years through little wars and skirmishes and treaties and agreements to bind them all together. So the fastest way to unify them all was simply to conquer them all under the Soviet regime and standardize one system across the whole lot of them. And really, when you look at how they've left their system, their school system is standardized, their bureaucratic system is standardized. It's almost a mirror of Great Britain's system. So it was ready to join into this new union, you see. And even though they call themselves independent today and independent countries, they've still got the same system as Britain and elsewhere. So the world has been standardized in Europe faster than most areas through the totalitarian regime of communism. So that's what it really is a fast way to standardize it. It's the same thing if you look at Vietnam. Vietnam used to be a country of a few hundred warring tribes, much like Afghanistan. And they had tried the Communist Party in there before to unite the public, but the tribes kind of liked it that way. Each warlord liked his little realm and his cuts and so on, and living the good life. They didn't really want it. So they needed a foreign enemy, and it had to be somebody who was really foreign to them, so they brought in America. And by the time America left there, the only party that ran the country was what was now the most popular party, and that was the communist system. So it was a very fast way to unite all those people in time to join the United Nations and the blocs and so on. So you'd understand how it really works. So bankers like socialism, where government is top-heavy, everything's run through bureaucracies and agencies of government. Socialism also can have public-private partnerships, which they also love because generally the private partnerships are the world bankers. And the bankers run the whole show, to be honest with you, because every socialist country is always buried up to its neck in debt. That's the key to it.
We uncovered at one of the World Economic Forums that they were pushing that public-private partnership big time. I mean, you know, it was unbelievable how they were indoctrinating all the people, the attendees there at that forum there in Davos, Switzerland, you know.
Yes, and with the private partnerships, you see, government really can say to the public who complain about certain agencies, well, it's nothing to do with us, we can't do anything about it, they're really a private organization. And that's true, they come under a different set of rules than the government themselves. The government must at least try to appear that they're open to the public and answerable to the public, whereas the private partnerships get them off the hook with that. They just say, well, we can't do anything about it, they're a private company, you see.
You know, there's a company out of Spain, BAA, that owns all the British airports.
Yes, that's what's happening. Canada, actually, most of its troops, it was revealed in the papers recently, for the last 8 years or so, have been trained by the Blackwater Corporation. That's who's been training our troops. These mercenaries have been training the Canadian troops. Yeah.
What's interesting about BAA is that they took over another company in Spain called Centra. And Centra has been instrumental in Texas in operating some of these toll roads.
That's right. That's another key to it too, what's fascinating with public-private is you see the public pay for the building of these big projects, such as highways and so on. We pay, and once we've paid it, the government turns around to its pre-planned sales guys and say, we'll give it to so-and-so. They put it up for tender, supposedly, but it's all planned in advance who's to get it, and they get it for peanuts, for pennies.
You know, there's an interchange there west of Dublin when I was over there in 2006, and I went through there, and it was privately built like we're talking about, and the private company that owns this big interchange is to funnel them into the other, you could say, divided highway system there, you know, in Dublin. But it's fascinating. They offered it back to the Irish government for 4 times what it cost them to build it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's a beautiful con. But they've done this, you see, Britain was a prototype for private-public partnerships. And how Britain used to do it, and Britain is a template for the world, you see. Everything's tried there first.
Under Thatcher, was it not true that under Margaret Thatcher they started this privatizing into their own hands?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Is that right?
That is correct. Under Thatcher, by the way, the IMF was running Britain. Most folk didn't know that until recently. The IMF admitted they had to go in and do the books for Britain. It was so bankrupt. And they started selling off the so-called public, the gas works, the coal industry. They sold off so many industries to these private even the water supply is owned by a private, for the whole country, is owned by one company.
Right. There's a company out of Belgium called Suez Company.
Mm-hmm.
They used to own the Suez Canal along with the French and British interests.
Yes.
They are operating all kinds of infrastructure throughout the world, water projects and so forth. It's just amazing what they've been able to accumulate into their hands.
It's astonishing. Well, again, the beauty of the public-private deal is the public not only pay for the building of it, and then it's given or sold for a token payment by the buyers, the private guys. The public continues to pay for the upkeep and repair of it. So the private guys are reaping nothing but profit. That's the beauty of it. We continue with the upkeep, yeah.
And frankly, it keeps the general population confused because we think we're dealing with governments, but
Yes.
we're actually living in a very corporate, communist world. Corporate as in commercial world.
That's right. Now that's how Carroll Quigley explained it. He said it's a new feudal system. Yeah.
We think we're living in a governmental system,
listening
and we're
audience,
not.
if they go back to that Fabian society that you studied in the past, Alan, is that a key sort of to seeing what's going on?
That's right. The Fabians themselves, remember, were started by a bunch of people who belonged to the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Astor family gave most of the money to start it up, and he became Lord Astor, of course. They were all international financiers that started up all of these organizations. In America, they had the Ford, the Carnegie, and the Rockefeller foundations to do the same kind of thing. And so they bypassed your governments by creating parallel governments. That's what Quigley called them. A parallel government which wasn't responsible to the public. They could, by using philanthropy, setting up thousands of non-governmental organizations, they could start a new type of democracy where governments would respond to those with the largest groups, which are now NGOs, by the way. That's only ones who get access to government and demand things, and the government are only too happy because they've already arranged that the NGOs should demand these particular laws be passed and so on. That's how they get socialism in. Yeah.
Yeah, another one of the keys to seeing this, too, is that these corporate institutions that were created and so forth, it looks like to me that it was a way to usher in administrative law versus constitutional law.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in their own writings, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is just the American branch of the same group, they said themselves, it was in Foreign Affairs magazine quite a few years back, that since they couldn't alter the Constitution, they had tried. They tried. They said they'd have to do a run around it instead. And how they did it was by setting up international treaties through the United Nations that would supersede the laws of the land. And that's what we've done from here on. And that's why that's why your governments can borrow from a World Bank. That's how they...
Universal, what is that, UCC, Universal Commercial Code?
Yes. That's right. And so they bypassed the Constitution.
Everything, right? I mean, they've turned everything into different corporations and institutions.
Yep. That's right.
Welcome back to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler along with
Charlotte Littlefield.
Welcome back, Alan Watt. And, what can we do to turn this thing around, and what recommendations would you make to our listening audience?
Well, for what's coming up, first of all, they themselves should try and get out of debt, personally, And for those who can get out of cities, they should be out anyway, if possible, to be self-sufficient as possible, because I think we're in for a rough, long-term ride here. So if you're in a little area where you can make a few friends who generally help each other out in times of trouble, that you're far more secure than you would be in a city. In a city, you're dependent for your food, water, everything from outside the city. All gets piped in or brought in through trucks. The more self-sufficient you are, the better. But to be honest with you, I think we might have to get to almost the stage of a crash or hyperinflation before the public are ready to listen to those who could lead them into a new way. And instead of going the way that the World Bank will lead them, which they will, they'll send out the right people at the right time to con us again. We should try and get our own people in. And the first thing they have to do and it should be on their mandate as well for election, is they're going to end the private banking system that runs governments. They've got to end that and start minting their own coin again and own currency as they were intended to do in the first place. That's the only way you'll get out of this. As long as you're under the heel of private international bankers and every government's off to borrow from them, we'll never get out of trouble. We do what the bankers say, you know.
Right. Go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head there. We need to get to the point where our own local and state banks charter our own banks that are independent of the collapsing Federal Reserve system, because there's a high probability that this is actually spun beyond their own control. It seems to me that they did not quite. What do you think, Alan? Do you think this has actually gone too far? Even
no, there's not. In fact, the Bank for International Settlements is responsible for the flow of capital from country to country. They've been running this show for the last 50 years. And so they can, and remember, all the currency's fiat to begin with. There's nothing to back it except the faith of the people. And so,
lie, period.
Yeah, it's all a big lie. So technically, every country could start afresh, write off the debt. Each country could do that, write off all the debt. You cannot possibly have governments going to the private banks, borrowing money and then selling that off as debt to people who collect it and who actually make profits as countries sink. We've got to stop this awful corrupt system and get back to the fact that government should be responsible for their own internal affairs and never borrow from outside. And never borrow either from any planted private bank. There's no need for it. The government's supposed to be in charge of the creation of money, and then they sell it off to the private banks. That's how they cover their costs for the making of the money. And that's how then the banks lend it out to us. But the government would have no need then to go and borrow money from elsewhere. But then again, you wouldn't have the totalitarian bunch at the United Nations running the show either. And that's the whole point of the fiat currency, is to give more power to private bankers and international bankers. That's got to be done away with, or we're all done for. Yeah, and it could be done away with. Yeah.
Supposedly we've thrown off serfdom and slavery, but we've not thrown off economic slavery, and that economic slavery is the fractional reserve banking system. Are you familiar with the new documentary, The Secret of Oz, by Bill Still? He did the Money Master documentary that was about 3.5 hours long in 1995. Yeah, he came out, and he's advocating for local state banks, basically, as part of the solution, where they self-charter, they create the currency, they spend it into circulation, but when the loans come back in, they destroy it, so that they don't hyperinflate their local,
That's right.
And I think it's a great, concept, and that documentary is called The Secret of Oz. And he basically, brought to life what was happening around the turn of the 19th century, or, the 20th century, the 1900s. And the person that actually wrote The Wizard of Oz was actually the same tale, but Hollywood kind of changed it when they changed Dorothy's slippers from being silver, meaning the yellow brick road, and then the silver of the people that tried to come in with silver, but Hollywood changed her slippers to be emerald, which totally threw off the whole meaning of the story. Yep. And I just thought that was fascinating. And are you familiar with this new documentary called The Secret of Oz?
I haven't heard of that one, but I know of the stuff behind the making of the movie and the symbolism in it too, and the Tin Man, the Straw Man, and so on. Were highly symbolic, again, of the con game. And at the very end of the movie, of course, the one you're all afraid of is really a man behind a curtain speaking through amplifiers and bullhorns, just an ordinary guy after all. Meaning the whole thing was an illusion. Your fantasy of something can keep you in absolute terror. Yeah.
Just like mankind, we can take control at any time. We don't have to give them our power.
That we don't have to at all. And Jefferson said it. See, what we're talking about tonight is exactly what we're talking about 200 years ago. Jefferson said that no generation can be born in to a pre-existing debt born and brought on by a previous generation. Because that's then slavery. You're born into a slavery system in that case. You should not be responsible in your generation for paying off the debt from the previous borrower. That's incredible. That's ridiculous. That truly is slavery. And we think this is all normal. No, it's not normal at all. This is an ancient system. And to be honest with you, they could write off it's all fiat. Who is losing out? It's nothing. It's backed on nothing. I mean, we're not passing gold bricks around or anything. It's all fiat. It's a con game. You know.
It could be forgiven.
It can absolutely be forgiven. It can be torn up. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course they want to keep the big game going, and the general ignorant population will continue, to go forward. Unfortunately, not, fully understanding that it's all a con.
It truly is. Yeah.
And I certainly hope that somebody. Do you think Ron Paul? I mean, he was good for a lot of things, but do you think he truly understands the whole thing?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I look at lifelong politicians as lifelong politicians. They're lifers. Politicians are known eventually to compromise on various things, which they shouldn't. Even if they'll stand firm on one or two, they shouldn't be compromising on all the other stuff that's wrong as well. So I'm very suspicious of lifelong politicians. And he went on about auditing the reserve, and the Wall Street Journal just this week talks about the fact that the latest attempt to audit the Fed had been turned down, and that was in the May the 7th Wall Street Journal. Plan for congressional audits of Fed dies in Senate. So that will never happen. We need a cleaning out of the entire system, to be honest with you. And it might take a real crash, a brought-on crash, to make the public wake up for the first time to the fact that the whole thing's a con game, an absolute con game, where it's so incredible. We were talking about the Wizard of Oz. I think about the carbon taxes that we've all to be hit with. It's the greatest thing of it. It's beyond the Wizard of Oz. I mean, there's nothing even tangible to look at as a trade. There's nothing there. It's a complete fantasy, CO2.
Yeah, one piece of advice that I've always heard, and from very wise investors and so forth, is that you can take some of these fiat dollars, so to speak, and if you can convert those into tangible, real property or something that's real, would that be good advice?
Absolutely. That's why they call it real estate.
Right.
That's true. If you hold no land, then you've nothing. Everything is unreal. Yeah.
Right.
There's a little levity in you still, right, Alan?
That's it. Yeah.
It's all in the language, to be sure. Someday I'd like to talk to you, Alan, about just the meaning of the language that we use between us.
Yeah, that's right.
You've made a study of that, haven't you? Words and language and how it affects us?
That's how they run us, is by the technique of language, and how they can actually bring us to the conclusions they want us to come to by giving us a specific type of language, giving us the problem in a set format, knowing our logic, just like a computer, our logic kicks in, and we will come to the very conclusion that they planned we'd come to. You're absolutely right. It's a science, and it's called neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics by the marketers.
We need to have you on, and we need to have a show dedicated just to that.
Yes.
Yes, you do. That would be fascinating, just to dedicate a show to that.
Yes.
Alan Watts, thank you very much for being with us. And cuttingthroughthematrix.com is his site.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Bye
Thanks,
now.
Alan. Bye-bye.
Bye now.